So my paper is called Location Independent Organizations, Designing Collaboration Across Space and Time. And this was part of my dissertation work. So for me, this paper really sits at the nexus of this idea of distributed work and organizational design, right? So when I think about distributed work, I think about this idea of individuals being physically distributed and having this reliance on technology-mediated communication in order to do work, right? So the idea of distributed work has a very long history, right? There's a ton of literature about that. It's a very well-studied topic for multiple decades. However, technology and organizations are continuing to evolve and continuing, I think, to innovate. And this idea of designing sort of virtual first, or as I call them, location independent organizations. And so I think it's, there's a lot of interesting questions still to be asked here. So one of the things that I find quite interesting is there's, a lot of different types of geographic distribution, right? So this doesn't look the same for all organizations. And there's been, prior work done on this. So people have looked at this idea of team configurations and subgroups and the implementation or implications of that, right? So this idea that if you have 3 people in one office and 2 in the other, the way interactions happen and bonds form might be different than if you have, say, 5 people in one office and a single individual not in that office, right? There's also been work done around global distribution. So as an example of this talk, exactly, right? Like if you have people in India and in Sweden and in San Francisco, then it's really difficult to have events or meetings that are happening at the same time, right? That are synchronous. Sorry, I'm just opening the chat here because I see a bubble. Hello. Yeah, so, so you can do it, right? But someone's making a sacrifice, right? So we have people on this call where it's midnight and 3 a.m. and I'm sure lots of other very inconvenient times. And so it can happen, but people are making sacrifices in order for that to happen, right? One of the interesting developments that sort of come out of recent research is this idea of contrasting work from home versus work from anywhere, which I think is a nice sort of summary of this idea, right? So this research looks at work from home, which is the idea that people can, work in the office some days per week, work at home some days per week, but you're really constrained by the city that your office is in, versus this idea of work from anywhere, where people are really free to sort of leave that city and leave the constraints of what an office might mean. There's also been quite a bit of research on temporal structuring of work. And so looking at sort of what time means and time means in the process of work. With respect to distributed work, there's been a lot of research looking at this idea of temporary co-locations or site visits to really build familiarity, to build those relationships that can then last between sort of those site visits. And there's also been work looking at sort of the efficacy or ways to use this idea of asynchronous written communication, right? And this goes back to, studies that have looked at letters written in the Renaissance up through sort of the idea of sending emails today. So from a more organizational design perspective, there's really 3 broad approaches to dealing with distribution. So the first is this idea of modularization, or really, right, reducing interdependence between groups. And this can be sort of split on any factor of choice. So we see this often around function or product, but it can also be done around location. So say you have one office that's all your engineers and another office that's your marketing team. And within those groups, there's a lot of interdependence, but between them, you're really reducing that. And that's a way to allow for physical distribution. Another way is by establishing this idea of common norms or work standardization. This can be rules, routines, this idea of tacit understanding, but basically the amount of direct communication that's needed between people in order to do their work becomes limited. And this may also be reduced over time, say with tacit understanding, this amount of direct communication needed keeps on going down. Sort of the last way is this idea of sort of ongoing technology-mediated communication. And this is really taking this idea of just traditional organizations, structures, behaviors, and using technology in order to make those work, right? And so this is where we see a lot of prior work. And then that prior work has really highlighted a lot of different challenges. And so when you're thinking about distributed individuals using technology, there's really this a propensity for sort of limited shared context or limited shared identity. It's really hard to build that up among people when they're not seeing each other in person. There's often sort of incomplete or disjointed information sharing, whether intentional or not, right? So we've all sort of missed someone on an email at some point. It doesn't necessarily have to be an intentional thing. Misunderstandings are quite common. This can be around language if you have a global organization. And there's also potentially delays in work. So going back to this idea of time zones, if I have to wait 8 hours for you to reply, you reply, then you have to wait 8 hours for me, right? So work can often get quite delayed. And so we see, even with the solutions that sort of are being used today, there's still quite a few challenges, right? And so I was really interested in this idea of how at the organizational level, they're designed for interdependent distributed collaboration, right? So really interested in teams and groups working together, and those groups working together throughout the whole organization and how that is done. So like in my title, I studied this idea of location independent organizations. So these are companies that have no office at all. It's quite an extreme case. Everyone's working remotely. Everyone's in their own location. So if there's 400 employees, they're in 400 different locations, right? Generally, there's no restriction on geography. The organizations that I studied in particular, they are full-time, the individuals are full-time employees paid with benefits, right? So this is not a case of sort of freelancers or people coming in and doing gig work. These are full-time employees that we're talking about. And so here's a quote here from Amir, who is the CEO and founder of Doist, a location independent organization. And he says, "We are designers, engineers, and communicators united by a common goal, not a common location." And so in order to study these companies, I decided to do an inductive multi-case study, right? So these organizations are an extreme instance of distribution. I studied 6 different organizations in order to sort of confirm patterns between them. When I was selecting the companies, like I said, I was really interested in work that was interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. So these cross-functional teams. So because of that, I chose the SaaS industry, or software as a service. One of the other benefits to that is this idea that these were sort of the first companies to move into this location independent model. And so they've been doing this for quite a while, right? So the companies I've studied as of 2019, so all of my data was collected before the pandemic, they had been around for 8 to 15 years. And so they had really stable practices. They were successful organizations. And so they ranged in employee size and capital raised. And you can see here the 6 different organizations, right? And so again, some quite large. Now 3 of these have over 1,000 employees and have raised hundreds of millions of dollars. So the first thing that I found when going through my data and when looking at these organizations is that there were really 2 distinct patterns, right? And so I've termed them asynchronous oriented and real-time oriented. They were similar in a lot of ways, right? So both of them use traditional hierarchical structures. They're all software companies, so they all used sort of modified versions of Agile, where they're working in these multidisciplinary teams on 2 to 4 week cycles. And then they're having regular retreats. So every 6 to 12 months, they were getting together as an entire organization in a physical location. But they also differed, right? So the asynchronous organizations, I saw, really had limited weekly meetings. So for non-managers, they really only had 1 to 3 meetings on their calendar each week, right? So they would bring up their calendar view and they really only would have a couple scattered things on there. In contrast, the real-time organizations often had 6 to 8 meetings per week, at least for non-managers. And so you're seeing a lot more of this real-time communication between individuals. For the asynchronous, they weren't expected to respond to communications right away, and they weren't really expected to have like a daily work schedule. Whereas the real-time oriented, they were expected to respond very quickly to any sort of communication that was sent, right? So you can think like Slack, if someone pings you, they were really expected to sort of get back to them as soon as it was reasonably possible. And they were also given suggested work hours, right? So this wouldn't be an 8-hour block, but maybe 4 or 5 hours a day. They were really expected to be available to their coworkers. And so again, 3 of these fell into the asynchronous category and 3 fell into the real-time category. And this was something that came out of the data. This was not something that I sampled on, and you can actually see, right? So in terms of the large, very well-off companies, there's actually 1 in each group, 1 smaller one in each group. And so it really wasn't a case of sort of these different metrics with their size determining their behavior. It was a design choice, right? And so one of the asynchronous companies, right, they were telling me, right, real-time chat wasn't working for us. We needed something more asynchronous, especially with the time zone situation. Right? In contrast, sort of coming up to the same issues, the real-time organizations took the perspective of, we are not asynchronous. We need everyone to overlap during the day so that they can talk to each other, right? And so these are 2 very different perspectives on how they're organizing work. So, you know, there's different implications for these different things just based on the time. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time here. The real time, they really are doing a lot of what we would expect to see, right? They're using technology-mediated methods to communicate. They're using video meetings and having conversational text chats in much of the same way you would expect any sort of organization to have. In order to get information across the company, they're relying on their hierarchy and sort of these different reports to come out. I'm actually going to spend the rest of the time talking about these asynchronous oriented organizations, right? So they were really intentional about limiting these real-time interactions between people, which allowed for greater flexibility and really shift the knowledge from something that was in an individual's head to something that was in this information space. And they did this with 3 distinct practices. Right, so the first is this idea of an open single source of truth. And so this is really an accessible collection of work, often work that's in progress, right? And so this is not something that's being saved as presenting it to your coworkers. It is how you store it, how you look at it, how you end for the day. And the entire company pretty much has access to that. Right? And so if anyone needs it, they can come and look at it. Another key aspect of this is that the observed information is really the same to everyone. And so by default, you're getting access to the entire organization, and you're really expected to be able to go in and look for anything that's being shared across the organization. And so here's a quote from a designer, right? He's saying, each day I work on a project, I post screenshots and comments. The idea is to design in the open. Anyone can follow along, and they can even add comments. Right, so the second practice that I saw was this idea of rich work trails. And so this is really intertwined with the open single source of truth, but it's a little bit different in the sense that this really provided a lot of context for people when they went to look for information. So instead of just seeing, right, the decision that's made from the end of a meeting or meeting summary, you're really documenting and sharing the entire work process that's happening. And so this requires a lot of transparency, but what comes with that is this idea of context, right? You can get context around prior work without actually having to have a conversation with another individual in the organization, right? And so here, one of the informants is talking about, I can go back to the beginning days, even before they were an employee, and they could look at the whole conversation. It was perfectly preserved, and they can see why a particular decision was made and the thought process behind it. All right, so the final practice is this idea of informed action first iteration. So this is really this idea of being self-directed and making decisions without waiting for a manager's permission. And here someone's talking about, right, like, I made this decision. I think even in our handbook, it says it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. And I am way over time, so I'm just going to wrap this up quickly. I think this work has a lot of contributions to give both to the distributed work side of things, as well as this idea of organizational design, and that there's a lot of, there's these different configurations that happen, and they have different implications, and they are not better or worse than each other, but they're just different strategies, different ideas for how people are looking to organize work. So I'm gonna stop sharing now and maybe take one question if anyone has it before we quickly move on to the next presentation. Yeah, Laura.
Hi, Jen. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. And it's especially interesting when I start thinking about what's going to happen after COVID or how have things changed. So great that you got the data at this point. Just have one quick question, and that's related to, you talk about organizational design, but to what extent was it planned? I mean, how was this integrated into the organization's strategy, or, was it, did it emerge? Was it top down, bottom up? So if you could just comment on that.
Yeah. So great question. So all of the organizations that I studied were location independent from founding. So from day one, that was a choice they made. It was a decision so in 5 of the 6 organizations, even to this day, the founder is the CEO. They're also private companies. In the 6th one, the founder's like a chief executive in product. So he's still around. It was a decision they actually had to make repeatedly over time, right? So as they were growing and they would run into new things, especially as they started raising capital. So again, these were some of the first organizations doing this. And so as they were going out to raise capital, like venture capitalists would be like, what do you mean you don't have an office? Like, how does this work, right? And so this was actually something that they had to repeatedly decide was a core part of their identity and what they were doing over and over and over again. And a lot of it had to do with hiring, actually.
Okay, thank you. But I was wondering about the strategy that they took with the organizational design, like real time or not. Was that a rational or planned decision, or did that just happen?
That's a good question. I think for the asynchronous, it was definitely intentional. They've put a lot of work into this. Actually, the 3 companies that I've studied that fall into this category, in the early days had very little interaction with each other in terms of like sharing practices, right? So I probed a lot around how they came up with these ideas, and they all seem to involve relatively independent. And over the years, like I said, they're 15. Over the years, they've become more aware as they've grown, and they've talked a lot more. I don't get that same sense from the real time there's some intention around certain practices, particularly like if you talk about hiring or different things like that that they do. But in terms of overall sort of like, how are we going to collaborate? How are people going to talk to each other? Much less intention with the real time. Yeah.
Okay. Jen, can I ask one question from my end?
Sure.
Yeah. Interesting work. I was just wondering, again, I'm also curious like Laura in terms of identifying the real, like the deeper cause of what is it that makes the two different, you know. Possibly digging deeper, and I'm trying to understand. I'm still a little confused in terms of why would the two organizations go two different ways. And the second part possibly to the question is, does it have any implication on, let's say, the outcomes? So what was it that the organizations which are organized in the asynchronous versus the real time, does it have an implication in terms of the performance, the level of organization or the work that they're doing?
So really quickly, in terms of outcome, I don't have an answer for you, right? So this is one single case study. I sampled all successful organizations. And so they are all considered successful. They said they're all still private, so I don't have financial information, but they're all still growing. They're all still raising capital and doing very well. So no, I don't have an answer for you on that. I think it would be a really interesting sort of follow-on study to think about that in a broader sample. In terms of going one way or another, one of the things I didn't get into here that's sort of in the broader paper is the motivation for why they did this is often related to labor markets. And so there is some discussion around sort of limiting that to North America versus not 100%, but like the bulk being in North America versus sort of being a little bit more global. There's not a clear and obvious distinction. So I'll just leave it there because I've, again, gone way over. And so I want to get to the next person, my session chair hat back on, which is actually you. So yes. If you want to go ahead and share your screen and get
started. Share my screen. Thank you. Yeah. So thank you, Jen. Interesting work. Possibly I could connect to it a little. We have studied global virtual teams of one particular organization called Cyient. And we looked at how do the employees get engaged when they're working in the context of global virtual team. And we are trying to link up possibly a trigger, if that could be the cultural intelligence of the team, that could lead to employee engagement. And so we have attempted a team level analysis for the data set that we have. We are 4 authors. So I'm the only one today here. Unfortunately, we don't have the other co-authors here. I would have loved them being here because since it's a quant study and I'm not such a numerate person, so we had the analysis being done by Sirish and Fareen Fatima, so they're not here. So I'll try to address some of the technical questions if it's in my purview. So let me go ahead. So this is a very, very simplistic representation of a global virtual team. Very rightly mentioned at the beginning that possibly this is also one of the examples that we are right here. So where we are saying that the members could be located, in this case, if it's a 7-member team, the locations are 4 and all of them connected to the technology, so to say. Now, if I look at Zen, I think very clearly pointed out in terms of how there is a proliferation of the virtual teams and all of it more with the trigger being the technological developments which have taken place. Some of the characteristics already mentioned in terms of the multiple nationalities, they all have different time zones and reduced face-to-face interaction. And also these involve individuals around the world with different competencies. So the organization that we worked with works into the engineering and solutions, and they have global collaborations happening all over the world. and all based upon the kind of from different part of the world. So again, it is much more independent of where you're located. It's more in terms of the competency that you have, that you become part of a GVT. A simple definition of the GVT as a group of geographically, organizationally, and time dispersed workers together by information, which come together by information technologies and trying to accomplish one or the other goal for the organization. So the motivation for this study was that, like how we understand that there are certain challenges which comes with GVT. So there's extensive reliance on technology. So accordingly, you have to select your appropriate communication channel. There are time zone differences. There are increased physical distances, face-to-face communication being less. And this gets reflected in, as per some of the studies which are there is reduced amount of trust. Trust becomes a very, very critical component when you're looking at GVT. Possibility of from multiple nationalities, from different backgrounds which come together. Psychological isolation, monitoring of the work is an issue. Absenteeism could be an issue, and low individual commitment. These are some of the negative reflections in terms of the outcome of being part of a GVT. And interestingly, some of these have been actually the link of these variables to the employee engagement has been studied in the co-located team. However, what we found, the context of GVT and how does it impact the employee engagement in GVTs is not really studied, although the co-located team has been studied. So we were interested in trying to understand that in the GVTs, would it be a different ball game when it comes to employee engagement? So if you look at the literature, I think it's pretty muddled. You can see, I didn't go the the animated way because it would have taken at least 5 minutes to explain this diagram itself. So the start was personal engagement by Kahn, where he mentioned about the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral investment of energies from people. Post that, Harter study, trying to kind of define it in terms of the organizational employee engagement. Sachs study, Schuck and Wollard, Macy and Snyder. So you'll find different terminologies in terms of engagement. So personal engagement to employee engagement to behavioral engagement, collective organizational, psychological state engagement, trait engagement, work engagement. So there are multiple labels which are there for the engagement. So we have kind of taken the definition by Schuck and Wollard. So if you see the basis of most of this work, which is on, let's say, the left-hand side, is these three aspects of cognitive, emotional, and behavioral investment of energies. And here it is more the work engagement. The dimensions which are studied are the vigor, dedication, and absorption. Here we have the uterus scale, which is used for set of scholars. They use that. So in our study, when we said we are taking the definition, we are saying employee engagement, the way it's defined by Schuck and Wollard, is it's about employees' cognitive, emotional, and behavioral state, which is directed towards outcome. So it's again a deviation from what Kahn mentioned, because his was more in terms of the personal engagement. Here, when Schuck and Wollard talk about employee engagement, it's more at the level of the organization. The individual investment of energies, but being reflected more towards the organizational outcome. So going forward from here, when we look at now the data or the literature on cultural intelligence, so that's the second important part of the study. So again, the very, very famous definition that it's about a person's capability for successful adaptation to the new cultural setting. 2007, little bit refinement in the definition, saying that if you are able to grasp, reason, and behave effectively. Accordingly, these were kind of operationalized into 4 dimensions: the metacognitive, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral. So these are 4 parts of the cultural quotient, and there is a scale to it. So when we looked at how is it that the studies are there in terms of cultural intelligence, we found that the studies mentioned that people with higher CI or the cultural intelligence, they work effectively with people from other cultures. They delay their understanding because they want to now accommodate situations. They have altered behavior in culturally diverse settings. So these are one set of findings there. The other set was in terms of when we look at how about the CI in GVT context. So there are studies which have already looked into the conflict and communication, knowledge sharing, and the impact of the cultural diversity on creativity. Okay. So again, here the gap we observe that possibly there is not a study intelligence and employee engagement, and that too at the team level. So the third important part that we wanted to focus on in this study was the trust. And the common definition of trust that goes is, it is about the willingness of one party to be vulnerable to the actions of another based on the expectation that the other will perform the action important to the truster, irrespective of whether I monitor or not the other party. So more about a dyadic relationship. However, the definition has also been extended to the team level. So what happens when you talk about trust in the team members? So similar definition gets extended for all the members of the team. Now looking at these three important constructs was actually triggered by another study. So it's a larger study that this paper is part of. So as one of the papers was where we had found, again, it was a qualitative conceptual model, where we had found a link between the cultural intelligence, trust, and employee engagement. So taking the inputs from there. So this is the research side that I mentioned. So the organization name is Cyient. It's headquartered in Hyderabad. It is into the engineering services and solutions. It has more than 15,000 plus employees. And interestingly, the main reason for taking up this site for the research was the 600 plus GVTs that they have as a form of organizing their work. So that was interesting. Again, it is a global across 58 plus location. That made it a very, very interesting research site for us. The measures that we have used for our study is cultural intelligence. We go with the Yang et al. Scale, which has got 4 dimensions. Metacognitive, cognitive, motivational, behavioral. The employee engagement, we measure using the Rich et al. Scale. Physical, emotional, and cognitive engagement. And trust, we go with the McAllister scale, which measures the cognition-based trust and the affect-based trust. So these are the dimensions in our model. So this is the pilot study. So we began with the pilot study because the McAllister scale is more on the dyadic relationship, and we wanted to extend it to the team. We made certain adaptation to the scale, and therefore we tested first in a transportation business unit with 66 mails being sent. We found 46 valid responses, and we had to change two questions based on the understanding, especially in the Indian context. Then in terms of the main study, we did in 2019, September was the main. 2 mailers sent, and the third one on 7th August. Survey sample, if you look, it was 3,200, in which 2,400 were from India location and 800 from other countries. Response rate is 29%. Valid responses out of 927. Team-wise, if you want to club these data into team, we found that there were 217 teams which got represented here. So this is in terms of the reliability, the Cronbach alpha coming more than 0.79 or 0.78 in most of the studies. Also in terms of the discriminant fidelity, this is the representation. Confirmatory factor analysis, again, the first order measurement model. These were the findings. This is the second order model that we wanted to check in terms of our model, that the relationship between cultural quotient and employee engagement as a mediator. If we see our results are saying that the direct effect is there, there is partial mediation, not full mediation. So that is, so our conclusion basically saying that there are more factors possibly which are responsible for the from the cultural quotient to engagement. So this is when we said that we added on to the existing literature also in terms of doing a team level analysis. Level 1 multi-level mediation, again, structure equation modeling, and the level 2 team level. So these are some of the results which came about. Again, the mediation not being so strong, being reflected in the results. So if we go with the implications here, partial mediation is what we are thinking. So in terms of how does the team trust play an important role between the cultural intelligence and team engagement. Importance of individual and team level cultural intelligence. So most of our measurement is an aggregation at the team level. So our conclusion also is in terms of practitioner. What we are mentioning is that it will make a lot of sense in terms of training employees who are part of the global virtual team on the cultural intelligence. And also if you could measure the team engagement differently. So the next step that we are into is about designing possibly a scale which can measure engagement at the team level. So the limitation, again, very obvious that it's part of a single organization, and we could not really tap into, possibly that's our next study in terms of the various variables which would be mediating the relationship. So that's when I will stop here and take the questions. I was looking if we could also study in terms of how Jen, kind of is now looking at 2 different types of team, and we could categorize some of our team, let's say whether it was really a real time or an asynchronous. But the teams that are there mostly in the sciences, they're collaborating, let's say, on projects on geospatial, engineering and other things. It is more or less they are on the real time. The heavier reliance is on real time, although I would say every work in a GVT context would be both a mix of asynchronous and real time. Thank you. Thank you so much.
We're a small group, so if anyone has a question, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Me again. Thank you very much, Evan. That's a very interesting study and an incredible sample, I mean, in terms of how you're able to study. I just wanted to know if you could comment, though, on some of the constructs. They seem to me quite related. When you talk about cultural intelligence, you've got these motivational factors, you have them also in the engagement, and trust is maybe something in between. If you could comment on how you dealt with that, either theoretically or statistically, to tease apart some of these concepts or constructs.
Unfortunately, the person who is more into the quant is not here. But in terms of the overlap, if you are asking about the construct, yeah, so one of the ways that the discriminant validity that I showed, which was helpful in terms of identifying that there is less overlap there. So if we look at the engagement, so there are 3 dimensions to it. In fact, there's another interesting way which we wanted to look at is because all the 3 have these, emotional, behavioral, and physical part. So when you measure engagement, you have, similar dimensions there. When you measure trust, you have affect-based trust, you have cognition-based trust. So we actually wanted to see if there are also, kind of a relationship that it can establish that the cognition-based trust possibly leads to a much more, it impacts the cognitive aspect of the employee engagement, which is reflected, let's say, in the much more absorption, the dedication that the person shows. And unfortunately, we're not able to tease apart in terms of these sub-dimensions, let's say, of trust or employee engagement. So that's not what that we have done.
But I like what you're thinking about there, though, in terms of understanding how these are connected. And
yes, possibly. I have noted these. Thank you. Thank you. Interesting.
Okay, let's move into the third presentation, and then we can have some extra time at the end for questions if there's extra time. All
right.
Yeah, we can see it.
Can you hear me? Yes, I'm unmuted. Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Nikhil. I'm an assistant professor at Indian School of Business in the OB area. I've been here for 2 years. I finished my PhD at INSEAD in 2019. So this paper is with my colleagues Deepa Mani and Madan Pilutla, who are both professors at ISB. So this is a domain that lies basically outside all of our expertise, as in I don't really belong to this session in the sense that I don't work on virtual teams. This paper is a result of an interest to do something related to COVID last year. And we had some data that we thought we could use to study remote work. It just so happened that we had collected some data before the pandemic, and we thought that could allow for some interesting investigation. So even though the paper itself has been through a couple of rounds of review, so it was rejected at the JAP fast track COVID submissions, for which we wrote it initially, and then later got a reject and resubmit from ISR. So even though that it has gone through those rounds, we still consider it to be fairly early work, largely because we are also learning a lot about this area as we try to refine these ideas. So yeah, I look forward to hear your comments, given that I assume you all work in this area a lot, and therefore having your feedback on this would be very helpful. Okay, so it's goes without saying, right? So that remote work arrangements have become really common during the pandemic, obviously due to the need to socially distance. At the same time, they represent also a phenomenon that is likely to outlast the pandemic, in the sense that several firms, for instance, have announced that they will offer permanent remote work arrangements to at least some of their employees. Right. At the same time, the anecdotal evidence, media reports, some surveys conducted by media companies have revealed that employees' reaction to remote work during the pandemic has been mixed. Right? So, for instance, a Gallup poll done right at the beginning of the pandemic, at least in India, but maybe a little bit into it in the US, where these people were located, revealed quite a lot of heterogeneity in terms of people's willingness to continue to work remotely after the pandemic, right? So the exact figures, so about 59% of the people said they would want to work remotely as long as possible. The remaining 41% largely didn't wanted to get back to work as soon as possible. So which suggests that there are factors that determine that kind of can account for variation in how satisfied people feel with these remote work arrangements. So which is what we wanted to get at. We wanted to explain heterogeneity in employees' experience with remote work during the pandemic. Okay. So yeah, and of course, there's a huge body of work on work from home, remote work, teleworking. It spans fields. So two limitations we could identify of this work, and we thought that given the data we had, we could kind of address those limitations. Were one, that most of the studies that we looked at tended to use naturalistic designs. Right? So, which means that employees and the organizations that they belong to were self-selecting themselves into remote work arrangements. So what that means is that, so contrast that with COVID, right? In this case, both organizations and employees, the remote work is mandated for them rather than them self-selecting into it. So one could expect that these effects could potentially be very different. And it's not very clear that one can readily generalize what we know from this prior work to the influence of COVID-induced remote work on employee outcomes. Second, very little work has evaluated the role that job characteristics play in determining effects of remote work on employee outcomes, right? So at least one meta-analysis and another very recent review paper call for more research on the effects of job characteristics on remote work outcomes. So why is this important in the COVID context? Simply because remote work here is really, really pervasive, right? So it's everywhere. And there is if one looks at the set of kind of firms that were working remotely very often earlier, so giving employees that option, a vast majority of them tended to be from IT or financial services. Now it's much more prevalent. So because of how pervasive it is, it becomes more important to kind of evaluate how variation in job characteristics influence the impact it has on employees. Right. So those were kind of the two limitations that we thought we could address. So yeah, so to more concretely, right? So what we do is that conceptually we evaluate the extent to which two important employee outcomes: productivity on the job and how isolated they perceive themselves to be. How that depends on need for human proximity, right? So which is a job characteristic in this case, and refers simply to the degree to which execution of tasks within a job requires interpersonal communication. So note that it's not tautologically kind of a given, in the sense that we are not saying that it requires physical kind of co-location. It requires communication. That is the measure. Right, and additionally, given that the most widespread response to the need to work remotely is to use information communication technologies, we additionally also evaluated whether any systematic differences in employee outcomes across low and high NHP jobs that we observe are kind of further moderated by the intensity of use of video conferencing capabilities. And so can they, for example, buffer the effects of high NHP, detrimental effects of high NHP on employee outcomes? Can video conferencing do that? So yeah, so the theory and predictions for this initial draft are like fairly straightforward. So I'll go over them very quickly. So the idea is that essentially remote work entails a separation of employees from a common workspace location. And the argument is that employees who need to communicate more are likely to experience more of a disruption, therefore. Right, and by definition, because high NHP jobs require more communication, these tend to be jobs that involve more equivocality, and they need more communication of interpersonal cues, and all of this would kind of suffer in a remote work arrangement. So these jobs that require more communication are more likely to be disrupted due to remote work. And second, like with isolation, it's also the case that in prior evidence suggests that in high proximity jobs, people also tend to form stronger social bonds at work. So it kind of is a more central identity to them. At the same time, people also self-select into jobs. So people who have a higher need, let's say, to interact with others, be close to others, are also more likely to select themselves into professions that allow for it. Right? So then we also predicted that people in high NHP jobs are also likely to feel more isolated while working remotely than those in low NHP jobs. Okay, so these were the two predictions, the two main effects, so to say, of NHP on productivity and isolation. Right? And then additionally, we evaluated the extent to which the use of video conferencing capabilities buffered these effects. So here is this. I'm sure all of you have an intuition about this, but these are just the trends of Zoom and Skype searches right after the lockdown in India was initiated at the end of March 2020. So you see like a huge increase. So clearly that this is like the standard response, right? And this is what we rely on while working remotely. And with regard to that, again, both of the arguments that I mentioned previously imply an inability to interact, right? So, and therefore you would expect that video conferencing capabilities would kind of buffer, because the disruption is more for high NHP jobs, greater reliance on video conferencing. Let's say if it's facilitated by the organization's technological infrastructure, is likely to kind of buffer these effects to a greater degree for high NHP jobs than low NHP jobs. Okay, so yeah, so with regard to data sources, so we had the NHP measure was a pre-pandemic measure, which we believe is a strength because it's then it's not affected by any change, let's say any redesign of jobs post the pandemic, right? So it's a measure, it's a pre-pandemic measure. So what we did a survey of about 3,000 people, and we scored 107 job types on various task characteristics, and I'll just show you like what the exact questions were. So the questions. So these were the two items we used from a larger rubric that participants responded to. And so this comes from this paper by Brynjolfsson and Mitchell in Science. So it's a larger rubric that aims to capture a job's suitability to machine learning. And one of those components is the need for is the requirement for interpersonal interaction. So so this item, the average of these responses gives us the NHP measure, and so the alpha corresponding to this measure is about 0.67. So that, and then so this was done for 107 job types, and the latter data source that I'll come to was captured the employees' sectors. So we used like a separate data set, which is called the a separate source of data, periodic labor force survey, which kind of allows us to consolidate those 107 distinct job types into 21 sectors, and then we get an NHP score for each sector in the Indian economy. And so it represents, so a data kind of that pool of 3,000 participants covers all of these 21 broad sectors in the Indian economy. So we get a score for each. And this is what it looks like. So these are the NHP scores across those sectors. So yes, and then the second data source was a survey that we conducted after the pandemic had begun. And so in India there was a very strict lockdown, and one of the strictest in the world, as quantified by like media houses and surveys. So there was a complete lockdown. Nobody could step out except for essential things, right? So that happened about at the end of March last year. So our survey that I talked about earlier, that provided the NHP measure, was done by January, and then there was the lockdown. And then we did an online survey of about 403 people who were working remotely to get measures of their productivity, their perceptions of isolation, and their reliance on video conferencing at work. Right? So that's what we do. So we combine a pre-pandemic NHP measure, so need for human proximity measure, which is a task level, job level characteristic, where the employee experiences once this lockdown in India had begun, to evaluate the effects that it had on them. So here are the questions from the latter survey that capture the three main constructs. So this also captured several control variables, which I'll not go into in the interest of time. So one thing to note here is that the productivity measure is kind of so allows for both like less productive and more productive, right? So it's the delta in the productivity change while working remotely. So this is the model specification we use. So we use seemingly unrelated regressions. So because we find the error terms for these two are correlated, these two estimations. So we have the NHP measure, of course, which is at the sector level. Then we have also both individual and organizational level controls, and I'll show you the controls when I show you the results table. But they include things like the total number, the size of the organization that people are working, and whether how many people report to them, and so on. And then in addition, we controlled for suitability to automation. The idea being that suitability to automation is typically negatively correlated with a need for human proximity on the job. So we wanted to control for that, because this paper by Brinjolser and Mitchell considers the two to be, in some sense, their rubric considers the two to be distinct. So that is another measure we included, which came from the same process. The pre-pandemic survey also allowed us to measure suitability to automation. Okay, so here are the results. I'll go over them very quickly. So if you look at the first kind of variable here, which is the sector NHP, right? So we do find support for the first set of hypotheses in that remote work efficacy is negatively affected by sector NHP in terms of productivity and in terms of perceptions of isolation. Right? So it leads to more isolation and lower productivity. And for video conferencing, we do find that there is a buffering effect on productivity. So it seems that a greater reliance on video conferencing has a positive effect on, has a disproportionately more positive effect on high NHP employees than low NHP employees. But we don't see it for isolation. Right? So it doesn't seem to kind of remedy the more isolation that high NHP employees report. Okay, so those are our main findings. Right? So in terms of the hypothesis, we do find support for the first three, right, but not the last one, which is that the negative effect of video on high NHP job employees in terms of the higher isolation they perceive will also be disproportionately remedied by video conferencing reliance. Okay, in terms of implications, so our goal when we started doing this was to study remote work during the pandemic. So we believe there is some value in understanding it by itself, right? So it's distinct from remote work that has existed before, and especially the focus of research that has studied that remote work, which tends to typically look at self-selected employees and organizations. Second, one implication is that also to the extent that the need to socially distance comes from risks associated with being close. So we also find that the remote work is particularly disruptive for jobs that are most likely to be affected by the pandemic, right? So the people who interact a lot with other people on the job are also the most likely to need to work remotely for longer, and so therefore these employees are particularly susceptible to negative effects during the pandemic. Second, third, so with the communication and coordination challenges, one can adopt, and I think Jen also touched on this. So task modularization is one kind of approach. So you which essentially means that you try to redesign high NHP jobs so that they become low NHP. So that is one. And then second, investments in technological infrastructure. So these our findings suggest that both of these are likely to have particularly high benefits for high NHP jobs. And next, targeted remote work policies, we believe are likely to serve organizations better than sweeping ones. So several organizations have, since the pandemic, announced policies that would allow all employees to work remotely, or in fact even mandate them to work remotely. So our findings suggest that it's important to kind of understand the role of the specific work environment in which they are situated, and evaluate the consequences of that on remote work efficacy before relying too much on these policies. Finally, so we don't find that reliance on video conferencing buffers perceived isolation for high NHP jobs. So this could be due to two reasons. One is that high NHP, so one is simply that video conferencing is not as good as direct face-to-face communication, let's say in terms of conveying social cues that make people feel connected. The other is it's simply that how exactly we use video conferencing, right? So for example, if we'd gone to AOM, the interactions would have been perhaps much more fulfilling. People would have gone to socials and so on, but but in this case, people are only, let's say, meeting during the presentation, right? So maybe it has more to do with how exactly those video conferencing capabilities are used. If they are used for social activities, they in fact would buffer people against perceived isolation. Yeah. So that is basically what I had in terms of what we are doing now with the paper. So we recently analyzed some other data. So in response to a reject and resubmit from ISA, we are trying to completely shift focus and considering looking at suitability to machine learning as a predictor of employee resilience during the pandemic in India. So basically looking at job review, so online reviews of companies by employees to see how they evaluate their companies pre and post the pandemic, and whether these evaluations are kind of better sustained or better post the pandemic for jobs high in suitability to machine learning. The idea being that compensatory kind of redesigning policies were more available and effective for these jobs. So yeah, I mean, that's completely unrelated to the rest of what I said, but I thought I'll let you know what we are planning to do with it next. And yeah, so I'm happy to take any questions or comments that you have.
All right, if anyone has a really quick question, we can do that, but I'd like to move us into the last presentation pretty quickly here to make sure they get their full time as well. So are there any quick sort of clarifying type questions? No? Okay, let's jump into the last presentation, and then if we have time at the end, we can come back and do more questions.
All right, so yeah, then I will share my screen. All right, so first of all, really happy to be here to present our paper. So the name of the paper is Employee Fixed Digital Mindset Beliefs and Feelings of Helplessness in Virtual Teams, the Role of HRM Alignment. So the author of the paper are also here in this session. So we have Elizabeth here and also Laura. So just talking about virtual team or distributed work or remote working, we have different labels of it. And I think the previous scholar have been presenting their very interesting work that we know a little bit about what distributed work is about, right? And if we're looking at the very recent published report from World Economic Forum on the most in-demand job for 2021, and also onward for the 5 years, is that organizations are very much looking into how they can expand the remote work. And when we talk about remote work, it's not just we having like a home office or team members sitting in different locations, then they magically can work together nicely. But it also involves a lot of implementation of new digital tools enable the collaborations and community to continue, right? And so in that report, they're also looking into what are the things that companies are looking at. Mostly they're looking at how to digitalize work processes, right? And so in that regard, meaning that working in virtual team, we are not just having a different working locations and working together. We are also dealing with a lot of digital processes. We are working with a lot of new digital technology in order to go about the work that we are doing. So there has been a lot of study looking into the pros and cons on virtual teams. So the pros would be we have more flexibility, we can utilize talents all over the world, we can be more inclusion, right? And that we reduce physical constraints for recruitment. The cons would be that based on previous study, people feel less satisfied with the team. They tend to have more task conflict. They tend to share knowledge less. They also tend to communicate less, right? So with these all challenges in mind, and also thinking about the work itself is not a more digitized that you have to, in terms of job demand, that you have to also work with the increasing, changing environment in terms of what kind of like a digital tool set that you're working with, and that we then start asking, so is that all people that actually can work in virtual team settings just as well as everyone else? Or would that be there are certain kind of like a personal characteristic that can influence how they cope in that environment? So a couple of years ago, Elizabeth and Laura and I, we started a conceptual work looking into digital mindset beliefs. So mainly we're looking into two types of digital mindset beliefs. One regarding personal resources in terms of the extent to which a person believes that digital ability is fixed instead of that they can be changed or improved with effort. The second set of digital mindset, we are looking into the individual cognitive framework towards organization resources. More specifically, the extent to which a person believes that organization resources are fixed, meaning that how they see, the pie is fixed or expandable, right? And so borrowing from the game theory, we understand that individual, if they see the pie is fixed, they tend to be more competitive. They tend to see resources is something to grab instead of seeing opportunity to expand or alternative way of doing things. So in that conceptual work, we also see, we have interviewed quite a few people, and that we see different kind of like a cognitive pattern when they seemingly having different kind of mindset beliefs. And so coming down to our paper, then we want to look into how this different digital mindset may influence individual working in virtual team in terms of feelings of helplessness. So helplessness is the negative affective psychological state that happens when an individual see the issue that they experience in the situations are out of their control, right? Something that they have tried but failed, they felt like there's nothing else they can do, right? And the result normally they comes with a sequence of attempts, and that they didn't get what they see could be possible, and that the feelings of helplessness emerge. And so just now we talked about the cons of being in virtual team, and that we tend to communicate less, we share less, we tend to be less satisfied, we coordinate less effectively, right? And that on the top of the increasing job demand of doing the different ICT tools in order for us to stay in tune with the team member, we consider that could be a stressor for individuals that have a higher fixed mindset, right? And that in particular, we consider that seeing themselves that technology ability is being fixed, and also the organization resources are fixed, individual working in that kind of team setup may feel more helpless than individual with less fixed mindset. And since virtual team is really a lot about how digital processes are in place, and so that we consider whether or not there is an alignment of HRM practices may influence that relationship, right? And so alignment of HRM practices would be to what extent that the organization HRM practices are compatible with the virtual team arrangement, right? Such as whether or not visibility will actually influence an individual promotion, right? So we know a lot about working in virtual teams, you tend to be less visible, right? Especially if you are not located in the headquarters or in the office, right? And then you become less visible to the teams, and that you may have less promotion opportunity and so forth, right? And so if the HRM practices do not take into account of virtual team setup, and that such a misalignment may trigger those individuals with a high fixed mindset feel even more helpless. And so then we collected data. The data was collected before the pandemic, and we collected in international company. They actually have a tradition of using virtual team. And we thought that setup would be good in terms of this is not something new, right? This is something the organization has been using for quite some time, and so that it is really the individual characteristic in terms of the cognitive mindset may play a role in there. So we collected data 2 times. So the first time was in March 2018, and the second time was in 3 months later, when we collected the outcome variable, which is the feeling of helplessness. So here are the measures for both the fixed digital mindset about personal resources and also the fixed digital mindset about organization resources. We have modified from peer study and adopted to more specifically on, in terms of personal resources, on technology ability, and for the organization's resources is more looking into how individuals see technology as a way that may take away resources from them in organization. In terms of perceived HRM alignment, there is a 7 items that we adopt from peer study, and feelings of helplessness, we using the 3-item scale. And all of these scale achieve good reliability in our study. So here's the result. And so maybe better that I move on to the graphic because it become more visible. So this is the first hypothesis. The first hypothesis, we expected that the combinations of digital mindset belief about personal resources in terms of how an individual see their own technology ability, in combination of high fixed mindset about organizing resources. That particular combination will, or the individual with that combination will feel more helpless working in a virtual team setting. And in what is showing here is also confirming or supporting our hypothesis. For the second hypothesis, we expected that for individual having a high fixed digital mindset belief about technology ability will feel more helplessness if they are having or perceive a low HRM alignment. However, the results didn't show us what we have expected, in the sense that we have the interactions were significant. However, as long as the individual having a high fixed digital mindset belief about their technology, it doesn't really matter whether there is a high or low HRM alignment. They feel the similar level of helplessness. However, for individuals having a low fixed digital mindset belief about technology ability, and if they are working in an organization with where they see there's a high HRM alignment, they feel significantly less helplessness. And I can go to the next hypothesis, then we can compare the result. So for the very last hypothesis, we looking into the fixed digital mindset belief about organizing resources. We expect the same thing, right? In a sense that individual with high fixed digital mindset may feel higher helplessness if they perceive that there is a low HRM alignment, and the results support our hypothesis. So you can see that for the the solid line with the low perceived HRM alignment go upward, especially for the individual with high fixed digital mindset belief about organizing resources. And so we consider the result from the H2A and H2B are very interesting. They both confirm that it's an interaction, right? In the sense that if an individual having a high fixed digital mindset, either for personal resources or organizational resources, they respond differently when there is a low versus high perceived HRM alignment. However, the pattern were different. And what we see could be the explanation is that for high fixed digital mindset belief about personal resources, your own technology ability, this is a more internalized process, right? And that when you are in that internalized, you see yourself as the source for the trouble at work. You internalize that to yourself instead of to the environment, right? So whether or not it is high or low HRM alignment, it didn't matter for them. However, it helps those individuals with low fixed digital mindset when they are working in a high perceived HRM alignment. Differently for the high fixed digital mindset belief about organizing resources, these individuals are able to see the issue that go about at work can be a problem in the organizations that are missing out alignment in their practices. Right? And we thought that these confirmations of the hypothesis actually were interesting and makes a lot of sense to us. So the implications, our findings indicate the importance to take into the account of individual differences when organizations are reorganizing and redesign their processes, the organization structure and how they're going to do team setup. Especially when we see nowadays 84% of organizations in the survey from World Economic Forum across the world are saying that they want to expand the use of remote working. We need to take into considerations of individual differences in that matter, right? And especially individuals will need to see they have enough resources in order to cope with the increased job demand in working with the different digital tools that you implement at work. And that if there is a misalignment, whether it's different kind of pattern, it actually affects how they feel about the work in terms of helplessness, right? And that helps us to see a little bit of like the individual in the virtual team, which is most of the time in the virtual team research are looking at the team level, but we should shed light on the individual working in that team setting. And thank you. Is there any questions? And if Laura and Liz, if I'm missing out something, if you would like to chip in. Yes, we can.
No, I was just clapping. I don't have a question.
Thank you.
So one question, if I may. So you mentioned in terms of when you talk about HR alignment, you said vertical and horizontal. So which was the component which was, let's say, talking about vertical? So I could see horizontal in terms of you saying that some of the practices have to be aligned amongst, the. So in terms of vertical, did you see, let's say, alignment with the strategy, with the environment?
Right. So for the scales that we are using, we're mostly looking into the horizontal alignment in terms of to what extent the HR, like for example, work processes and how that is in alignment with the virtual team setup. Like for example, if we have the virtual teams that are global with different time zones, right? Do HR practices actually compensate individual working in the outside office hour, right? And that kind of alignment that we are looking into.
All right, I just got the 1 minute warning note. So any last questions? Thank you all for coming. Like, it was a great presentation, really interesting papers. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jen. Good night, good evening.
Oh, good morning.